Good morning, everybody. I'm Evan Medeiros, the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. It's a pleasure to welcome you to another event as part of a long-running series under our initiative for U.S. China dialogue on global issues. But today's discussion is unlike many of the ones we've had in the past. Today's discussion is not actually about China or even about the U.S.-China relationship. Today's discussion is about America and specifically American politics. And so we've titled the event American and Chinese Perspectives on U.S. Politics. And we've done something that I've wanted to do for a long time, which is bring together American specialists on American politics and Chinese specialists on American politics to see the degree to which their assessments, their views converge or diverge about what's going on in the United States. So what we did is we put together an event that brings together colleagues from Georgetown, colleagues from China to talk about what's going on in American politics to better understand the similarities and differences in American and Chinese views, and also, of course, to talk a bit about the role that China, the issue of China may be playing in American politics as American politics becomes more ideological, as coalitions build and, change over time. And so we're very pleased to be able to sponsor this event. It's a joint initiative between the Asian Studies Department in the School of Foreign Service, where I sit, and Georgetown's university-wide initiative called the U.S. China Dialogue on Global Issues. I want to thank my colleagues, Tom Banchoff at the U.S. China Dialogue, Eleanor Albert, Toya Wulan, and my colleagues in the Asian Studies Department, specifically our director, Yuki Tajima, because all of them have been incredibly supportive of our ability to put together and curate these important discussions that impact U.S.-China issues. So what I'd like to do is introduce our four very distinguished speakers for today. And then we're going to kick off a discussion about what's going on in American politics through both American eyes and Chinese eyes, and sort of see where we end up, the degree of convergence or divergence, and hopefully come away with some nice insights about how the China issue, the U.S.-China relationship may in fact be playing in American politics. So I'm going to introduce our speakers in alphabetical order. First, my colleague at Georgetown, Hans Knoll, who is an associate professor in the Department of Government. Thank you, Hans. His research explores political coalitions, political parties, and ideology with a focus on the United States. He teaches on parties, elections, political history, political methodology, and he lectures around the world. So, Hans, thank you for taking your time. Hopefully, this is a sort of slightly off the beaten path for you as an American political scientist. So we appreciate your patience and forbearance with what is going to be an experiment a little bit today, but hopefully an interesting one. Secondly, another colleague from Georgetown's government department, Jamil Scott. Her work focuses on political behavior, representation, race and ethnicity politics, and gender politics. She's currently working on a book manuscript in which she seeks to understand Black women's political emergence in state-level politics. And so, Jamil, well, we got to ask you at some point to comment at what just happened in Georgia, given your interest in state-level politics. Third, we have Sun Zhe, an old friend. He's a visiting research scholar and co-director of the China Initiative at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs in New York. He's the founding director of the Center for U.S.-China Relations at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's worked very closely with many different government agencies in China and is just very well known and well respected as a keen watcher of both the United States and, of course, the U.S.-China relationship. And then fourthly, we have Wang Hao, who is an associate professor at the Center for American Studies at Fudan University, well known, I'm sure, to many listeners today. His research interests include U.S. politics and foreign policy, Sino-U.S. relations, and international relations of the Asia-Pacific. So to all four of you, thank you for your time and energy today. I'm going to just kick it off by going to Hans. And Hans, would you sort of give us a quick sort of 6 to 8 minute laydown of the outcome of the midterm elections, sort of broad trends, what it may mean for 2024, and perhaps touch on aspects that may be relevant to how China is going to play going forward. I can tell you in the China world, we hear a lot about a newly Republican House of Representatives, Speaker McCarthy leading a big delegation to Taiwan, really sticking it to the Chinese. Is the Republican Party in the House coming out of this feeling emboldened, or is China sort of rapidly becoming an afterthought? But over to you, Hans, and thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks very much, Evan, and thanks for having me. And I think this will be a really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say on things. I think it'll be really useful if we want to get like the big picture to actually start, as you suggested, with the midterms, because I think in order to sort of explain what happened in the midterms and capture some of the more interesting dynamics, we'll along the way sort of have to explain a lot of like the big long trends and where things are going. So that'll be really useful. And where I want to start is with the view that the midterms were a bit of a surprise, which I think they were to a lot of people. There was an expectation for a lot of observers that Republicans would have done much better than they did. There's talk about a red wave, a sort of overwhelming support for Republicans. I think the evidence going into the election suggested it might have been a muted wave, if anything, but still it was expectation I thought was going to be that the question was going to be just how big will be the Republican victory. And very few thought it was going to be as small as it was, although Republicans did take control of the House and they only lost one seat so far in the Senate. It might not be a difference in the Senate. So it's not a huge loss for Republicans, except for relative to expectations. So why do we think that? Why did we think that that Republicans would do so much better? If you look at the polling, there's a lot of noise in the polling. Polls often are hard to get in, especially smaller, smaller areas that like a particular state or something. The nationwide polling is a lot easier. And so there's a lot of, misses in the polls in either direction. But on average, the polls weren't that far off. And they did, within the margin of error, certainly predict something like what we ended up seeing. But it wasn't really just the polls. It was that we thought, well, since we know polls are noisy and we want to think about which direction reality will be aside from them, the expectation would be that the Democratic Party would lose seats because the Democratic Party controls the White House. And there's a long-standing traditional sort of pattern in American politics where the party that controls the White House loses seats in the midterms. Sometimes a lot of seats, sometimes not very many seats. So how many would be a big question. But we think that the reason that they lose seats has a lot to do with the election being kind of a referendum on the president and people evaluating things in terms of the president. So even though constitutionally we elect elect Congress separately from the president, and so in theory they could go on separate tracks, voters see everything connected and they say, okay, the president is a Democrat, and if I'm not happy with how things are going, then I would want to not give him more support in Congress. And people haven't been very happy with how things have been going. Biden is not particularly popular. He's not historically unpopular. His level of popularity is about where most presidents have been at this point in the past several years. Sort of in the past several cycles, like so in the sort of mid 40s or something. But we have had presidents that have been much more popular, and he is on that other end. Moreover, we think that part of the story is like how happy people are with the state of the economy, and that is particularly bad, at least by the measures that we usually look at. And so the expectation was then that those things would translate into dissatisfaction with Biden, dissatisfaction with the Democrats, and you'd see Republicans picking up a fair number of seats. I would not have been shocked based just on that if it was a historic loss for Democrats. But it wasn't. In fact, it's going to come in to be sort of on the Democrats have lost seats, but it's going to be on the upper end of those losses. And so then the question is, why not? And I think there's several explanations, many of which have to do then with the larger political picture. So one is just polarization. The relationship between the president's popularity and the economy and election outcomes may be getting weaker because now there's more of a floor and a ceiling for voters. There are fewer voters who are, I'm not sure which side I'm on. I'm going to evaluate how happy the president makes me and then change my vote. Most people are pretty safely in one of the two partisan camps. And a lot of the disapproval of the president, of Biden and of Trump and of other presidents, actually comes within the party, where it's, in this case, Democrats who are not happy with how Biden is doing. And so they're not going to switch and vote for Republicans to make Biden do more what they want. They're not going to like to have that kind of dissatisfaction. It's dissatisfaction of another sort. So that's part of it. Polarization means that there's less room for these things to matter. And so there's a whole trend about how we've gotten to where we are with polarization. I'm sure we can get into that more as we go, but that has been a dynamic that increasingly our political parties are ideologically sorted, and our political parties have more increasingly loyal voters. Another factor that we think mattered is the Dobbs decision. So the Supreme Court ruled that the Roe versus Wade decision that established a right to abortion in the United States was wrongly decided. And so it kicked the decision about whether or not there should be abortion rights back to the states. This mobilized a lot of people. It was a big change in policy. And over the summer, we saw some evidence that this mattered, although people started thinking, well, it was going to fade away by the time we got to the midterms. And I think we still need to do some more investigating about why people voted the way they did to be sure that Dobbs had a huge effect. But it makes a lot of sense if you think that the reason that people are voting against the president's party is because they're not satisfied with the president and how the president is running things. And so they want to, bring things, back from the direction the president's taking them. But there was a huge policy shift in the other direction towards Republicans, and so that may offset the desire to try to reduce Biden's strength, since Republicans demonstrated this huge amount of success. And then I think the last thing that matters is Trump in a couple of ways. I mean, one is that Trump helped get some of the candidates, the more extreme candidates that are a little bit outside the norm, helped get those candidates nominated. So people like Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. And many of those candidates were found to be, outside of what people wanted for a representative. But even aside from his nomination of candidates, Trump inserted himself into the election in a way that former presidents do not typically do. And so you got, in some ways, in 2022, a replay of the conflict in 2020 between Trump and Biden. And we already saw how that played out once. And so if Trump positions himself as this alternative, people who might have been frustrated with Biden, ready to move on another direction, now were reminded about the reasons they like Biden in the first place. And so there's a push there. It's also worth noting that in 2020, while Biden won the presidency, Republicans actually did well and picked up in the House, which is an unusual thing to do in presidential elections, and in which case there are fewer seats that Democrats had just barely grabbed in the first place that would be up for a loss on the part of Democrats in 2022. So then that is, I think, captures a lot of the dynamics that are in place, and then that puts us in a position where now we start thinking about 2024. And I think the read on 2024 is that most Republicans have decided that, whether it's true or not, that last point that I was making about Trump and Trump's presence might be true. And as a consequence, we'd like to, the Republican Party says, we'd like to, maybe not have Trump be our candidate. Meanwhile, Ron DeSantis did very well, outside the trend for Republicans. I don't know how much that's DeSantis per se. Other Republicans in Florida also did well, but DeSantis is getting credit for it, and people are liking DeSantis. And so, as an alternative to Trump, that becomes a sort of a clear choice. And one of the reasons why Republicans had a difficulty preventing Trump from being the nominee in 2016, and many Republican leaders did want to stop Trump from being the nominee. But one of the reasons that they had a hard time doing that is they didn't have a clear choice that they all wanted to focus around. But now it does seem like DeSantis is emerging as that choice. And so that may shape things up. So I wouldn't be surprised if DeSantis is the nominee in 2024. And I think he'd probably be a fairly strong nominee, and interested to see how that election plays out. The last point that I just jotted here, you mentioned to think a little bit about what this might mean for U.S. China relations. Again, I think we'll come back to that in the conversation, but let me lay it out just a little bit on this, which is that we talk a lot about how sort of politics stops at the water's edge, and that some international issues are going to be shaped by political experts and ordinary voters don't get too involved in them. And that's, not always true in all ways, but I think it is true on a lot of, our U.S. relations with China. It's not, sort of top of mind the way that what's happening in Ukraine is right now. And as a consequence, that gives party leaders a little bit of leeway to do what they would like to do to appeal to their more attentive base. So if it's the case that Republicans think that this is a successful way of reaching out to those voters, then you might expect to see more of that. And while Trump has been a champion of sort of, using China as a foil and blaming China for problems, he's not, unique or the leader of that among Republicans. And so I don't think that attitude is going to go away. And we'll see where things go. The next 2 years, though, with divided government, it's going to probably mostly be rhetorical rather than actually in a policy place. And that rhetoric might still matter, but we'll kind of see how that ends up mattering policy-wise, probably after the 2024 election. So I think I'll stop there, and
Great.
I'd love to hear what else thinks, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Hans. That's wonderful. Quick follow-up, Hans. So given the fact that the Republicans have a less than 10 seat majority in the House, how should we expect that to affect dynamics? So of course, it's divided government, but it's a lot less divided than they accepted. So does this mean it's hard for McCarthy to get stuff done? How much does he have to negotiate with the Democrats? How does the White House play? How do you look at that piece? Because seems like a big, important new variable.
Yeah, no, that is huge, and I can see lots of ways that it could go. I think the way that we would have said it went, in the past, based on other close divided government situations like this, is that you would see, Biden try to work and negotiate with House Republicans more to try to build coalitions that include the House Democrats and some number of swing Republicans, and you could move that, that kind of thing forward. But of course, Republicans control the agenda in the House, and so those issues that I've just described will be hard to get to the vote in the first place. So alternatively, Biden would need to work with the House majority and try to craft an agenda that's more acceptable to them. And I bet that's what Biden would like to do, and he may try to do that. But I think that the current partisan divide and the current attitude that many Republicans have will make it hard to find enough Republicans who want to try to follow that path. Right. And so if Republicans are going to be divided in the way that they are, it's just very, very hard for the final thing that could happen is that McCarthy could just try to move his own agenda through, but then that's going to get stymied by the Senate and everything else. So I think everything points to it being even harder than it has been to make policy progress in Congress.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Well, thank you, Hans. That's wonderful. So Wang Hao, I want to invite you into the conversation because you've spent your professional life looking at the American politics. So sort of what's your take on the midterm elections? So from a Chinese perspective, how do you look at political polarization in the United States, and what impact do you think the midterms may or may not have on the ability of the Biden team to get some of their work done, and of course China and the U.S. China relationship?
Okay, thank you very much, and I'm very honored to participate in this panel. And according to the request of Evan's email, I will focus on 3 questions. First is about the evaluation of the midterms. I think the result is generally in line with expectations. Just as Hans point, before the elections, we judge Republicans to be victories in the House elections, while the Senate is more uncertain. But frankly speaking, I did not expect that the House elections were so close. I already participated in 3 panels after the midterm organized by different Chinese academic institutions, including Tsinghua University, CICIR, and CIIS, from which you can see that Chinese scholars cared much about American politics. And most of us admit to be too optimistic about the Republicans. So I want to try to explain why the red wave did not appear from 3 aspects. First, I think maybe we should not expect any big wave, no matter red or blue, in an almost equally polarized political environment in the United States. I remember in 2018 and even 2020, some analysts expected the emergence of blue waves, but it was a narrow win for the Democrats in 2018, and in 2020, its advantage in the House even narrowed. Second, for the Democrats, the two major issues in the midterm, inflation and abortion rights, may have canceled each other out. I noticed before the elections, there were 1/3 of the voters put inflation as the primary concern, but there were also nearly 20% thought that abortion was the top issue. So the mobilization of pro-abortion rights voters played an important role in helping the Democrats. The third one is my assumption, that is Biden's middle course successfully mobilized some median voter. They, on one hand, accept Biden's economy first, domestic political agenda, and put cultural war aside. On the other, they worry about those who get endorsements from Donald Trump are too extreme politically. So my doubt is that, does this mean the vital center in American politics and society is still strong, not disappearing? And the second question is how American politics will evolve after the midterms, especially the problem of polarization. So here my key word is dual polarization or two-level polarization. On the first level, polarization between the two parties will be more serious after the midterms. We know that after the 2018 midterm, when the Democrats began to dominate the House, they not only initiated the impeachment of Trump, but also set up special committee investigating the Capitol attack. Such kind of actions already irritated the Republicans and made American politics evolve from veto politics to retaliatory politics. So it is reasonable that the Republican side will fight back. On the second level, polarization within each party will become more complicated. For the Democrats, as early as 2020, Biden himself admitted that he was a transitional figure. The future of the Democratic Party will be a more progressive one. After taking office, we could see that Biden never successfully integrated the inner divided Democratic.
Let's see, maybe since we've lost Wang Hao, he seems to have frozen. Jamil, we'd love to bring you into the conversation to talk a little bit about sort of your view of the midterms, identity politics, sort of your big takeaways and what you think it means for the trajectory of American politics as we look to 2024.
Sure. So I think I greatly agree with Hans here in thinking about the prospects for 2024, particularly around DeSantis and in his potential emergence as the Republican nominee or go-to nominee perceived by elites. I think there is going to be some interest among some other folks, seeing folks like Larry Hogan and Terry Youngkin being floated around as potential folks who are going to put their names in the hats. And so I think that means that we'll likely have a crowded primary, but that means that it won't take very much, too many votes, too much of a percentage of votes to get a solidified nominee here. And I think that while elites may have their eyes on DeSantis, it might be interesting to see what Trump is able to do or what he's able to pull out, right? Because in a crowded primary, there's only so many votes you can get, and you don't need too much of a majority to be the winner here. With that being said, I think that as we think about this election cycle, I think the conversations around a red wave, conversations around what the Democratic Party would lose and what the Republican Party would gain, I think is a really interesting conversation around how people are thinking about their preferences and what we expect from midterm elections. So this midterm election was, we saw higher turnout than what we usually do. By and large, midterm elections tend to be lower turnout.
And you
2018
mean
wasn't.
nationwide, Jamil? That's like a nationwide number?
So yes, turnout, it was higher, not as high as 2018, but higher than what we usually see. On average,
Got it.
midterm turnout tends to be low, right? And so with that being said, we saw more of a turnout here, but there were also additional questions on the ballot that were of interest to folks, like the issue of abortion. Some states took up marijuana laws. Colorado took up psychedelics. I don't know what's going on in Colorado, but interesting nonetheless, right? That we had ballot initiatives that were of interest to folks as well. So there was one more reason to come out on election day. I think it also can't be missed that we saw, because of the 2020 election, there was more interest in more availability of what early voting could do, and voting by mail. That, I think, became more normalized for folks who may not have thought about that as an option. It is very normalized in states like Oregon. That's just what they do. But in states like Maryland and other states like Pennsylvania, right? Some of the reason why we were later on, it was such a long wait for some of these returns is because early voting became a normalized thing that people did. Early voting, I mean by mail-in ballots, right? People use that option in more than we might have thought before, right? But because we were living in a 2020 environment where people weren't as comfortable with going to the polls, right? This new mechanism, this new way of voting became normalized for folks, and that's what they did. And so this shifted the conversation around what election day looked like. Would we get results immediately? For many elections, we did not, but it made for an interesting conversation around what the vehicle of voting looks like in the future, for lack of a better term. What are people going to do, but also what issues were of importance. We often think about American voters as pocketbook voters. What's in your pocket is going to dictate how you're going to vote. But I think in this election cycle was not just what is in your pocket, but what is in your arsenal of rights that people were thinking about as well.
That's a really interesting point, Jamil. Is that sort of as a specialist in American politics, is the fact that the inflation was very high, Biden's personal popularity is quite low, but that wasn't a useful predictor of the results. Is that interesting and surprising to you?
So I think that we can't discount the rhetoric of candidates, right? So there was a push away from Biden, right? So I think that there's a recognition, right, that people are thinking about the president, their pocketbook, and what's happening at the time. But I think we also saw candidates shifting away from Biden and talking about different rhetoric and issues, right? So there was some concern around, for instance, Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, that she just kept talking about the issue of abortion. And so some folks wondered, would that matter for her? Would she be able to pull out this electoral victory? But that was enough of a concern for folks. And so I think that sometimes we assume that the economic issue is not as important as some of the rights issues for folks. And for her in her district, it was issues around rights, issues around, particularly for the voters in that district. And so I think that we saw candidates subtly shifting away from Biden and rhetoric. And we also saw Obama come back out, right? He's for some folks, the people's president. He maintains a strong level of popularity. And so he was out on the campaign trail in a way that I think was helpful for some candidates, in a way that Biden could not be.
Interesting. So I know that you yourself have focused on state level politics a little bit. Is there anything at the sort of state level, any particular state level dynamics that you thought were particularly interesting from this election that you wanted to bring forward?
So I think in terms of states, I think it would be these down ballot initiatives that came to the table. We saw, so I think we can't not talk about Kansas and their ballot initiative around abortion. And it was pre-2022 election cycle. But I think I bring this up because I think that was an indicator that this was an issue that mattered to folks. It wasn't just going to be about the election, it was going to be about these important constitutional issues that people were thinking about as well. And so, we saw some candidates, at least as Secretary of State as well, that were bringing up some issues of concern around the election cycle and the legality around election results. And so that was a state issue wrapped around national rhetoric from Trump, right? These were candidates who were supported by Trump. Trump campaigned for them and kind of like gave them his personal brand, right? His personal, his recommendation there. And so with that being said, I think that we are in a state of politics where things have become a lot more nationalized. And so to see these issues taking hold in Kansas, and then to see it play out in states like Michigan, where abortion was also on the ballot, right? And there were also conversations around the legality of the election and whether or not we would see a Democratic governor win, right? I think all of those things are wrapped up together.
And so I got to ask you, Jamil, since everybody else has commented on it, Trump, what sort of, how do you think Trump is going to figure going forward? I mean, as just an interested American, it's hard for me to imagine Trump endorsing any other Republican. So how does that work? If he doesn't get the nomination, does he just burn the house down? Because hard to imagine him going away quietly, but.
Yeah. So that's interesting because I think that many people see Ron DeSantis as the potential, the could-be nominee, the person that people would select. But in my mind, he's been the closest to Trump's rhetoric, and he even adopted Trump's rhetoric during his election campaign in 2018. So he was very much riding Trump's coattails on language, on rhetoric, et cetera, right? So I think that if the Republican Party is able to get him to be behind anyone, it would be Ron DeSantis because they are closest, right? But I think it's going to be a hard sell for the Republican Party to get rid of Trump overall. He's still going to have influence, and the Republican Party would do well to try to think about incorporating him in some way if he doesn't get the nomination.
Got it. And last question for you, Jamil. Sort of, how do you think China plays in all this? I know this is not something you focus on, but how do you think, I mean, is it going to break through all the other ideological, highly polarized kind of issues? How do you think China plays going forward?
Yeah, so I think that this is an interesting question because we've seen conversations around China happen in relation to an identity politics conversation, as well as just a foreign policy conversation overall. So I'll start with the identity politics piece. So during Trump's presidency, he talked a lot about the coronavirus coming from China, right? And that led to blame. And what we saw is increased Asian American hate in the United States. And so that had a real impact on how people were thinking about Asian Americans, prejudice against Asian Americans, and that remains a large issue to think about, right? And so as we think about the tenor of what happens during this, I guess we would call flu season and all of the things that come along with the flu, right? Unfortunately, I think those conversations might come up again, and there might be another bout of thinking about how Asian Americans feel about their place in the United States, right? And prejudice against the group. And so I place all Asian Americans in this conversation, even though you asked me about China, and I'll say that because there has been in this conversation a negative association with China and people not differentiating other Asian American groups from Chinese folks. And that's not to say that that's right, but it's a negative stereotypical association that has been happening and has led to discrimination and hate crimes. And so we can't not think about how President Trump's rhetoric, former President Trump's rhetoric, factored into that, and the prejudice that is still underlying some of this conversation around the coronavirus. So from that standpoint, I think that this has led to some Asian Americans thinking about their relationship to not just the Democratic Party, but also the Republican Party, right? And I won't say that's necessarily for all Asian Americans, because as an ethno-racial group, it's a large group and it encompasses a number of people, a number of ethnic groups rather, as a whole. But I think that the prejudice that some folks experienced during this time, and maybe still experiencing, may have an impact on how they perceive the Republican Party and their voting relationship with the Republican Party moving forward. So that's a internal question. From an external standpoint, I think that there has been some really interesting conversations around Taiwan that have been happening. And I think President Biden has not been as clear about, been a little wishy-washy on his stance on Taiwan, right? And we have seen, Nancy Pelosi as the majority leader going to Taiwan. And I can see how that creates some interesting thoughts around where we go with foreign policy from that direction. Will the United States take a stance on where Taiwan should be in its relationship with China? But I also think there's a larger conversation to be had around how the United States moving forward thinks about its economic situation and what the United States expects itself to internally produce versus external imports. Sorry, that's a longer question, but a longer answer.
That's great. Let me ask both Jamil and Hans, have either of you looked at Asian Americans as a sort of voting bloc, and does that factor at all into the China issue? I ask because I've read a couple things about Asian Americans becoming more politically active, some of them being more conservative and more Republican in orientation, but haven't really looked at it systematically. So either of you have got views on this? Neil?
Hans, were you gonna say something? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, so I think here as it relates to Asian American identity and political behavior, as I said, this is they are an ethno-racial group that is encompassing of a number of ethnic groups within. And so what I think happens when we see threats posed to a group is sometimes we see activation, political activation, right? And so we've seen this with some groups engaging in protests and just advocacy, more generally in terms of how to political advocacy around the group. Do I think this changes political behavior for all? Will there still be conservative voting Asian Americans? Yes, there will be. But I think that there also, for them, may be a separation in terms of if they are perceived to be this negative group that has been talked about in the media, if that makes sense, that there's been association with coronavirus that is certainly stereotypical and certainly negative. But I think if some members of the larger ethnic group can separate themselves from that narrative, then they aren't necessarily feeling that negative feeling about the Republican Party. But for those who can't separate themselves from that perception, that may lend towards some differences in their decision making about whether or not they'll vote for the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party, or just more generally political activation overall.
Mm-hmm. Hans?
Yeah, well, so I would definitely agree with and defer to Jamil's expertise in this general area. And I would just add that so there are people who study, Asian American politics. It's not easy in a lot of ways, because typical survey research that we sort of is everywhere and has is adapted for other purposes, and then you can integrate the questions, tend to have very small samples of most minority groups, and certainly of Asian Americans. And so you have to have a sort of dedicated, specialized studies to get at those questions, which there are increasingly are, but I don't do a lot of work with them. But there are people who do that, but it's hard, and it's hard because not only do you have to have those particular studies, but the strategies that you use to oversample can sometimes lead to strange places where you say, okay, well, here's a neighborhood that has a high percentage of Asian Americans. So if we survey there, we'll get something. But of course, then that's the kind of, then you oversample the people who are in that kind of neighborhood. And it's just tricky to get those things. The people who do this stuff are very, very cognizant of all these issues. They do a really good job with it. But there's a lot of questions that we don't think have really good answers to on the nuances. And so then we can extrapolate from what we do know about, the sort of broader immigrant experience and the broader experience of being a marginalized group. And those stories, I think, I say Jamil's has a really good handle on described a lot of the literature that exists there. And I think that that's going to be a big part of the story. The different immigrant experiences are going to lead to different places. It's worth noting that a lot of people who come to the United States, on the one hand, they come from places that have different political backgrounds. And so they come bringing different political values. And it takes a while, maybe some time in their life, definitely some generations before there's some shift. And there are things that cause that shift to happen faster and things that have caused that shift to happen slower. And those dynamics, then on top of that, there's the dynamics of why people are coming and what are the events elsewhere that are leading people to want to leave where they are, as opposed to the attraction of coming to the United States. And so all those things are really can push in different directions. And it's really worth, slicing up any population to think about how does, not only by ethnic background, so not Asian Americans, but Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean, and so on, but also different degrees of time in the United States, whether it's recent immigrant or family from recent immigrant, or very large population of folks that have been in this country for many generations that are no less American than anyone else, but that you then get lumped in with that group the way that politics treats them. They get discriminated against. They get the COVID reaction falls on them as well, and so then that shapes a whole lot of things. So all of which is to say, I don't have a really great answer to your question, but I think it's a really complicated one, and there's a lot of really good work that's moving forward on it.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That helps a lot. All right. Well, we have Wang Hao back. So welcome back, Wang Hao. Glad to have you here. Wang Hao, I think what I'd like to do is, sorry?
I'm very sorry for the interruption.
No problem. No problem. We're very glad to have you back. I want to invite Sun Zhe into the conversation because he is a longtime watcher of American politics and American policy. And I'd be curious to get sort of, how did you view the midterms? What were the highlights from your perspective? And I know you think a lot about China and the U.S. China relationship. And so what are the things that are on your agenda now that the midterms are over? And as we've pretty clearly heard, the politics are not any easier for the Biden administration, and probably are going to be a lot harder and a lot more complicated and messy. So we'd love to get your insights, Sun Zhe.
Thank you very much. It's good to come back. The question, I think, we should ask ourselves whether we see the political change over the last few years. I think party politics, political polarizations, those racial tension, these are not new. It's not a phantom opera. These are existing challenges for American politics. So we're talking about the middle-term election, now coming presidential election, in 2024. We are talking about change of the government, change of the leadership, change of the policy. So the question in my mind, are American people happy about this change? So that is I think no matter how you lower your bar of expectation, a lot of people are not satisfied with Biden administration, with Trump administration, whoever elected. So I think So we have to think about the political change over the last few years. What kind of result bring these change of the administration, change of the policy, whether they reduce or they deepen the crisis. So that's a question in my mind. So I think the back to 2017, probably as high, I saw a poll, probably as high over 80% of the people think the Americans standing high among all the other countries. So America is an excellent, outstanding country, but people have some kind of a sense of self-doubt, a national sense of self-doubt. People begin to worry about the coming elections. So what I think I just read the Chinese government also published a paper, a white paper. It's very interesting. Sounds like funny. The state of democracy in the United States. It's very interesting. So the major criticism from Chinese perspective, money politics, dysfunction of the system, and some other social lack of social trust and social chaos, these kind of things. I think these are real. So this echoes what President Biden said. Both at home and abroad, we are engaged in a new struggle between democracy and autocracy. But nobody paid the domestic struggle here between democracy, how to make democracy working better. So that is a big question in my mind. So the second issue, what I worry most, what kind of political issues? I think I worry two things at least. First, as some people already said, whether the Trump influence. You read Washington Post articles, what will happen if Trump win again? So that I think the article says provided three scenarios. He will install the lawyers in his government. He won't listen to the senators. Otherwise, he will pull back the troops from abroad, but deploy more troops in the state. So to help him strengthen, consolidate his power. And then probably the chances of what we call the civil war increases. At least you will see more protest demonstrations. I don't see that kind of a radical scenario, but what if DeSantis got elected? He will repeat some of these Trump's policies, what Trump had done back to 3-4 years ago. So that I worry about, what kind of policy he will have. And a second thing I worry about is our politics are local. So we see the 50 pieces of concrete puzzles here, the local politics, how they play out. Last month, DeSantis and the governor of Texas sent those illegal immigrants to New York City, to Martha's Vineyard. The new target is Pennsylvania, so Philadelphia. So all these local politics, you have one governor against the other. So this is the party division, but also related to the policies, abortion, illegal. How do you deal with this kind of complicated issue? So that's I think I worry about two things. But to be fair, what I think the positive developments over the last 2 years, I think at least one thing is still American government trying to be more open, trying to be more transparent. I think back to 2009, President Obama signed a memo to be more open and transparent government. So I think that's one thing. People still think the government protect their personal freedom. So one thing I give credit. And also, you see how January 6th, the Capitol riot, and Fukuyama published, political order, political decay, these kind of things. A lot of people really worry about that. But the politics went back to normal. So it didn't go that far. So this is what Chinese people always says, Americans 纠错, self-correcting mechanism worked the last year. So that's why President Biden got elected. So that is the I think that gave credit to American political development, political change over the last 2 years. From the U.S. China relations perspective, I think we see the what I call the inner demons in both countries. You know, in the United States, it demonstrates the bipartisan consensus. You know, and also working with media and capitals. You know, so a lot of people see China as a new threat. A lot of people see the Taiwan issue as a core national interest, American national interest. So that is the new perception. And also see when I see the U.S. China relations, because of the domestic factor plays, and as in both countries. So we see the great fall of the U.S. China relationship. We see less people-to-people exchange. Back to before the COVID, about probably over 5 million people visiting each other. But now we only do this kind of a Zoom exchange programs. And also we see the intensified competitions or confrontations on Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang. So that is what really worries me. And I think the American searching is so, but the longest journey is a journey inside. It's also, I think, good for China to learn lessons from American political change. Thank you, Evan.
Well, thank you, Sunjo. Very articulate, very comprehensive. Let me ask you as a quick follow-up. In U.S. China conversations, I hear a lot from Chinese friends that their view is that income inequality and domestic political polarization has reached such a high level that America's animosity toward China, criticism of China, is just an outward manifestation of America's political challenges at home. Would you say, is that a commonly held Chinese view? And is it one that you, as a specialist in American politics, do you agree with that?
I don't agree with it, but I mean on the fact. But there's a perception, or you can call it misperception in China. So I gave a talk a couple months ago when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, and I gave a talk to a Chinese official media group. And I collect questions, in advance. And people ask me why Biden is so weak. She cannot stop Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, Democrats, his own colleagues, so he's a weak president. And also this time, he mentioned Taiwan to President Xi Jinping. People, all this was wonder he won't show compromise to China because domestic pressure, this kind of thing. So I think the domestic politics really play the driving force behind the policy making here in the state.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask both Hans and Jamil. This narrative in the U.S.-China relationship is very common, that American income inequality and as a result political polarization are at historic levels. And so Americans are just exporting their anxiety and taking it out on China. So just would love to get your comments. Is that a complete misreading of American politics? Is there some truth there? Sort of how would either of you react to that?
So I think that's a very China-centric way of describing something that I do think is true, which is that there's political motivation to identify other threats rather than threats that are domestic and that would you might want to try to protect from political pressure. So if I'm a Republican and I'm worried about trying to reach out to voters who are sort of economically and socially losing ground or think that they're losing ground. I don't want to tell them that the problem is that labor force participation is down and that there are all kinds of policies that that I, as a Republican, want to implement that might be causing these things. And so it's very easy to then point and say, oh, well, no, it's immigrants from Latin America that are taking your jobs. It's unfair global competition against places like China. It's these other things. And so then it fits into that package. I don't think that that's particularly new to the current polarized period. I think that you can see this historically a lot of times coming up. But and I don't think that the current inequality in the United States is particularly new, or for that matter, while polarization is at a different level, we've still had partisan divisions and we still have, incentives to try to change the subject in this sort of way. And I don't think it's unique to China. As I say, there's lots of blame that can be.
What would be an example, Hans, in the past of sort of blaming, diverting attention, blaming somebody else for?
Sure. So, well, I mean, so the whole Cold War is a story where the real problems that whatever concerns you're having in the United States, it's really just our failure to effectively compete with the Soviet Union, and so it's sort of offloading of those threats there. If you start elaborating, going beyond just well, there's some other threatening world power, and start thinking about just sort of other ways of shifting the topic, the repeated discussions about immigration, which are, we talk a lot about now, but immigration is not a new issue in the United States. It's been coming over and over, and that always has been about shifting the conversation away from something else. And then, you can see shifts even to other domestic issues, so that, economic concerns can get put behind racial and social issues if you want to avoid talking about the one, and you can threaten about and say the other is a concern, especially if you're the voters that you're appealing to are going to be sympathetic to those kinds of things. And so if you think that you can you can't reach out to somebody who's working class and who is going to lose their job because of conservative policies, but they will you can appeal to them by appealing to ethnocentrism or something else. And the way that I've just described that has been mostly from the Republican point of view, but the Democrats do this too, where they talk about really it's this other threat, it's really someplace else that's the real problem. And there can even be some truth to it, in that the United States is part of a global economy, and their global factors do matter. But it's very easy then to find the convenient target. So I actually think that there's probably a fair amount, if that's the story you want to tell, I bet you there's a lot of people that fits for. But the way that it's framed, which is understandable from sort of Chinese audience, to talk about how does this fit to our particular concerns. It's true, or at least it's part of the story, but it's not only is it not the only way this is happening, but then there are legitimate, global concerns that also, come about that they just get picked up in a convenient way. It's not like there would be everything would be peachy if there were no domestic concerns to make people want to talk about these issues. They would still have to talk about them in maybe slightly different ways.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Jamil, did you want to add anything here?
Sure. So I completely agree with Hans's point, and I think the through line in all of that is that one of the things that we often see is that when there is an economic issue or some point of competition, it is often easier to blame someone else, right? And we see politicians do that over and over again. And so as we've seen China rise as a political power, right? There's been this conversation around how does the United States compete and compare from an economic standpoint? What does that mean for domestic jobs? What does that mean for labor and products, et cetera? And so there's been an undertone here of competition, right? And so it's not necessarily just about China, but those conversations come up. And so where we see where we see these issues, or where we see blame being apprised to the out group here being China, is often where there are these where there is competition or where there are questions about what is happening domestically and why am I losing, right? And who might be to blame for that. And instead of politicians saying like, we can blame this policy that I signed on to, it's easier to say, right, there is this out group who is doing this work, and this is why we are in the position we are today.
And should we, getting into 2024, should we expect more of this? Is the inequality, the polarization going to push Republicans and Democrats as they prepare for the presidential election to, choose, China and the U.S. China relationship as one of those targets?
So I would say so that it becomes a bigger issue as we think about these conversations around what is made in America, what are American products, these conversations around clean energy, where do people go who worked in the coal industry for so long? How do we think about jobs and these conversations around just domestic productivity? And so that, I think, relates to a conversation around, again, what is being made or done in America, and what do we think about American jobs, right? Particularly, even though the job rate has, percentage of people with jobs has increased, right? Inflation is also on the rise, right? And some of that is on us, right? Because, there's some artificial inflation going on here as well. But I think as things get more expensive for folks, these questions around why and who is to blame, it becomes easier for politicians to say it's not on us. There's something else happening in the world, and we need to think about that.
Just Hans, your quick take: is China going to become even bigger issue as we prepare for 2024?
I think there's the domestic pressure to talk about China, I don't think is going to change terribly much. There may be some, some creative political entrepreneurs who want to make it be, an issue that they shift to. So that may happen. But that's been present, and I think that'll continue. I think what ultimately the reason why China is going to become more significant is that China's position in the world is changing and even increasing relevance to the global economy and global political conflict. We've had in the United States a sort of orientation towards Russia that is sort of a carryover from the Cold War. And what's going on in Ukraine makes that continue to happen. But I think what's going on in Ukraine also tells us that Russia's position globally is not what we thought it was relative to like how strong it is and how important it is, and that what the other places that the United States needs to think about, China's right up at the top of that. So I expect to see it becoming increasingly relevant. Becomes increasingly relevant, then politicians who want to do things on it, regardless of the domestic politics, will find a way to make it fit the domestic politics. So I do expect that the issues are revolving around trade and patents and all these kinds of things are going to continue to matter a lot, and maybe will matter more. But it's almost inevitable, regardless of however the U.S. politics plays out, because that's the world we're in now.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we've got about 20 minutes left in the conversation, and I've got a whole slew of questions here from the audience. And I want to bring Wang Hao back into the conversation. Can you hear us, Wang Hao?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Great. So Wang Hao, question for you. What trends in U.S. politics are most concerning from the perspective of Chinese scholars?
First of all, I think the problem polarization. I think most Chinese scholars agree that polarization in the United States is not good for the development of U.S.-China relations. And for me, I think it is different from the Cold War, because during the Cold War, actually within the U.S., there has been the Cold War consensus. And at that time, the politics is not that polarized. But now we have to face the reality that U.S. politics is highly polarized. And for U.S.-China relations, we Chinese worry that during the U.S. Elections, maybe China could become a target or a very important topic in your domestic politics. And from the 2020 elections and even this year's midterms, the China-related topics or issues always played a very important role, both within the Republicans and Democrats. So for Chinese, I think we hope that polarization in the U.S. could be softened, and in the future, maybe the two parties could reach more and more consensus.
How about you, Sanjay? What's your take on this? What trends in American politics do you get asked most about? What are people most concerned about?
I think I would like to add one point on the U.S. China relation first, then come back to the question. I think for the coming presidential election, don't forget there's also election in Taiwan 2024. So if I think from Chinese perspective, China card has been played again and again. So it's not new. But however, it depends whether for the next time play American politicians or candidates for presidency, whether you want to play Taiwan card or you play trade card, you play card, some other issues, Xinjiang, Hong Kong.
Yeah. Lots of cards being played, it sounds like.
Yes. And if you play trade card, I think Chinese people are more confident, or they are willing to deal with it, because even the American government work out what you call small yard, high fence, 小院高墙战略, right? And the Chip Law Act. And to a lot of Chinese, that is kind of a move trying to slow down the Chinese development. But however, you study the number. Last year, 2021, the trade volume between the China and the United States, $750 billion US. Think about the China and Russia, so-called all-around strategic partnership. The trade, it's only about 140. And Chinese investment in Russia, it's only $1 billion US. Right. Less than 1 billion. And Russia investment in China, it's 10 million US dollars.
Well, this is a bit of a paradox. Yes, the US has a very large goods trade relationship with China, 650.
So that's why. But if you
but yet political support in the United States for China is dramatically declining, right? The public opinion numbers are stark.
Yes, and I think if you go back to see how Chinese scholars, Chinese intellectuals, I think there's also rising concern, human rights issues, COVID policies, this kind of all the how the party new administration, they also there's a rising self-doubt in China as well. So I think a lot of people are losing confidence in the governance, whether the government can perform well in the next 5 years. So I think that's some legitimate concern when the American government criticizes China, human rights issue. There's a DNA in American politics, care about human rights, in other countries, want to export democracy, whatever. So I think back to the coming the question of coming election. I see I think there's the party divisions, still the polarizations of American politics. But I hope at least racial tensions, social divisions can be controlled. Something not affect the daily life of American people, because people care about their quality of living, whether they can find a job, so that's what I really hope for.
Sure, sure. So I've got, that's wonderful. Thank you, Sunju. I've got a couple different questions here. I'm going to sort of aggregate them, and these would be for Jamil and Hans. So both of you may know that in August of this year, former Speaker of the, or I guess current Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi traveled to Taiwan. It was a big deal. And many in the sort of China watching community, or I should say many Chinese, said, can't understand why Biden didn't stop her. And they said, well, Biden must be weak. He must be too weak to do that. So as experts in American politics, number one, do you agree with this view that Biden was too weak to stop her? And number two, now that we have a new House of Representatives and a new speaker, when the new Congress convenes, will Biden have, is your assessment, Biden will be weaker or stronger with that sort of new Republican Congress, but more from a China policy perspective? Obviously having the House being flipped makes the president less influential in setting agendas, et cetera. So I'm trying to sort of bring together your knowledge of politics and where the debate is right now in the China field. Why don't we go to Jamil first? What do you think, Jamil?
So one of the things I think we've seen about Biden is that he tries very hard to be a consensus builder, and I think that is indicative of some of his statements around wanting to work with Republican leadership this go round. But as it relates to Nancy Pelosi, I think that Biden has tended to take a stance of not being weak, but understanding that there are different dynamics that she has had to deal with. So one of the things that we've noted around just the House more generally is that, and maybe this started, perhaps we can see this with the Tea Party wave, right? In the early 2010s, right? That like there was a Tea Party wave, and House leadership fell down. Like we saw the loss of Boehner and Paul Ryan because they tried to challenge the Tea Party wing, right? It didn't go as well. On the other side, we see for Democrats this progressive wing, right? And we might include Bernie Sanders in that, even though he counts himself as an independent. And so I think one of the things that Nancy Pelosi has been able to do well is hold together a party that is divergent in some of its beliefs around where the party should go. And so I think that Biden has tried not necessarily to interfere with that. Do they work together? Yes. But does she also have some dynamics that she has to deal with in the House that perhaps I think he's cognizant of and not trying to interfere with? Yes, right. Because I think there are concerns around what happens with Taiwan, and members of the House have been thoughtful about that issue. And so
why do you think Biden didn't try and get her didn't really lean on her
to stop her, to lean on her to stop? I think because he's more of a let's build consensus and not fight. I think he's given her some leeway in how she does what she does, and honestly, it's been effective as effective as it could be given some of the dynamics in the Senate, right? And so I think his style is to, I'll leave you alone and let you do your thing, right? And for better or for worse, it seems to have been effective, right? Many people thought that AOC and other more progressive members of the House would be a problem for Nancy Pelosi to kind of wrangle people and to get an agenda going, and they haven't been, right? And so does that make him a weak president? I don't think so. I think it perhaps makes him more of a strategic president to not necessarily go against someone who could very much be a strong ally, but also could be a problem for him if she wanted to be.
Hans, what do you think?
So I think Jamil is right about how Biden approaches these questions. I think it's also worth noting, like, so constitutionally, there's not much directly that the president can't tell the Congress what to do, right? So it has to be a bargain that they work out, strategically behind the scenes. And I think actually they because Biden is somebody who is good at working with other politicians, that is one of his his apparent comparative advantage is he's not some kind of rhetorical leader. He's somebody who was good at working behind the scenes. And Pelosi too is good at that. She's good about building coalitions and holding things together and so forth. So I've got to believe that that they talked about this, about what would be the right strategy. And if it looked like it was a really bad idea from the point of view of the Democratic Party to have Pelosi go as she did, then probably they wouldn't have done it, right? So I kind of think it's like not that it's not maybe not the right framing to say that Biden got lost out on this. I think probably there was a thought that for what is necessary for Pelosi and the Democrats to succeed in the midterms, this is going to be something that is better, more upside than downside. And it doesn't hurt Biden to have China watchers say he's weak, really, in this sense, because it's not part of his the major things that he's concerned with. And so he's in terms of all the other issues that are on the table. And so it makes some sense to like make this strategic move to do something that it made sense politically for Pelosi to do. And I think that going forward, the position that Biden has with a weaker Congress, a Congress that has weaker from his perspective because there's fewer Democrats in it, is going to be frustrating. It's worth noting that it was very hard to make a lot of progress this last cycle. He did manage to pull things together, mostly because the only place he had to put leverage was the Senate, which he's really good at. That's his experience, his background. There's only so much that he's going to be able to do with the House, which means that the sort of symbolic strength type thing that this question's about may become more important because it's the only thing that he can actually do. That said, I'm not going to count out the ability of the White House to work with a divided Republican majority to bring forward some things that maybe will not only be policy wins for the White House, but that also might expose cleavages within the Republican Party that would be politically strategic and wise for Biden.
That's very optimistic of you.
Yes, it's a very optimistic. I'm not going to rule it out, so I won't. That's what I say.
Are you going to rule it in?
No, I will not rule it in. I think that, if I was going to predict anything, it's that there'll even more gridlock. The kind of gridlock that we felt like we were feeling the first half of the last term. And towards the end, things started to break loose, and I don't see that path as easily. So that's what I expect to see, in which case these kinds of symbolic, who's got, what kind of message can be sent by a delegation that is sent somewhere or anything else, that's going to become even more important. But even then, I think that Biden's going to make choices that, are good for the whole package. He'll be on the ballot in 2024, so he's going to need to make choices that affect his standing more than letting Pelosi do things that help the congressional standing. But I think it's still going to be a place where they're going to be thinking about how these things play, both how they play domestic politics, but then also how they play in the long-term, international relations strategy, which is outside of my wheelhouse, but obviously also matters a great deal when you make a decision about, sending someone to meet with folks in Taiwan.
Let's see, I got a couple questions here that I want to invite Sunja and Wang Hao to answer. Sunja, I have a few questions that basically, to summarize it, it's that there's a consensus in Washington now that the U.S. China relationship is sort of trending toward, let's paraphrase, sort of a new Cold War. It's getting to be a much more competitive relationship. And what do you think the implications of that are for Chinese views of the United States, and in particular, a sort of political consensus in China? So this is a little bit more about China and Chinese politics than the United States, but I thought that you could sort of handle that.
Thank you. I published a book, American Studies in China, actually back to 2006. And then in that book, I think I summarized who are the leading scholars, academic people, and who are the leading institutions. Chinese Academy of Social Science, they have a Institute for American Studies, Fudan Center for American Studies. So what they have published over the last, from 1949 to 1979, on the United States, politics, economics, this kind of. So I should update. I think the question of whether these Chinese views on the United States since 2010, the new social media rise in China. So WeChat groups, so a lot of people, they don't watch TV right now. So they use WeChat group to express news and their views on American politics. So who are the leading big V's, VIPs?
Well, Sunja, my question really is it widely accepted in China now that the U.S. China relationship is entering this new phase of more intense competition? And how do you think that affects Chinese perceptions of the U.S. and U.S. politics?
I think at least we can say most Chinese people under the current public education system, they believe that, whatever China is trying to do to improve the relationship, the United States government will slow down the Chinese development, something like that. So there's actually 4 groups of views. I published in the Foreign Affairs article outline these 4 views. One radical views prepare for the fight of the century. That's very radical. Another radical, supposed to be mainstream views, what Xi Jinping always emphasized, 1,000 reasons to cooperate, to live with the United States, work with the United States. So he wrote a letter to National Committee of U.S. China Relations end of October. So these are, I think, 2 radical views. Officially still insist on this Xi Jinping's view. But however, a lot of people believe in decoupling of this high-tech, technological decoupling happening now. And a lot of people believe, China should work more with Russia, with some Belt and Road countries, to avoid direct conflict with the United States. So I think the general public opinion, same thing. There's no consensus yet. I think there's a radical views. At least people think differently.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What about you, Wang Hao? How would you say Chinese views of American politics, and specifically the fact that the U.S. views toward China are hardening, how is that affecting Chinese perceptions of the United States?
I think in recent years, the most important evolution of perception on the Chinese side is that most Chinese people believe that the U.S. has already saw China as the only biggest competitor, and the only one country that could challenge the U.S. hegemony. So for many, the younger generation in China, they become much more nationalist and much more confident. So compared with their parents, I think these young people, they believe that the U.S. is like a very evil country and want to contain China's rise, and China should catch up with the U.S. Technologically. So I think this is one of the reasons why China's foreign policy in recent years has become more and more active, and even maybe we can say aggressive. So this is a very bad background, I think, for the stable development of U.S.-China relations.
Thank you. So we've got 3 minutes left, so I'm just going to do a quick lightning round. I've got a whole slew of questions about Trump. Basically want to ask everybody, I'm going to start with Jamil, about sort of what's Trump going to do in the next 2 years, and is he going to lean on the China issue as a way to sort of burnish his credentials? So what do you think, Jamil, in a minute
Sure.
or so?
Yeah, so I think in the next 2 years, this is really Trump has started early. So he started on his reelection campaign, and I think he's going to bring up some of the issues that have made him popular before, right? To kind of stoke some concern about what's happening in the U.S. right now, to make a comparison between him and Joe Biden. So I think his eyes is towards reelection, and he's going to be pushing some of the issues that have been brought up before.
Mhm. Got it. Sanjo, what's your prediction about Trump? What's Trump going to do in the next few years? What does it mean for U.S. China?
Um, I cannot predict him because he changed his stance all the time. So I think he will first attack President Biden, and then probably will criticize DeSantis. He work out new term, new word to describe. He's not satisfied with DeSantis. He made his competitor. So I think the over the next 2 years, he will try to appeal, make himself more likable to general public here. So China issues probably, I don't know, maybe he doesn't know that much about Taiwan. He doesn't know that much about the other things. So I think maybe by the end of this, in about a year, he'll play China card again when he do the presidential debate. Otherwise, his focus will more on domestic politics.
Hans?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what's been said, that he's going to be trying to raise his profile, and he's going to use whatever he can to do that. And the China issue is one that whether it's true or not, he thinks resonates really well, and he has a way of talking about it. It is, as Joe just pointed out, not entirely accurate the way that he describes what's going on, but he does what he has his story, and I expect that that will continue to be part of the story that he tells. And it'll be part of the way in which he tries to differentiate himself from establishment politicians, and especially from whoever he's running against, as that the rest of the field shapes up.
And Wang Hao.
Yeah, I think if the less than expected result during these midterm elections is attributed to Trump within the Republican Party, maybe the inner division of this party will be a challenge for both Trump and the party. But I still think Trump is very powerful, and no one could replace him. So I'm a little optimistic about him in 2024.
Okay. Well, Hans Knoll, Jamil Scott, Sanjo, Wang Hao, thank you very much. Today's been a fascinating discussion. As I said at the outset, it was a bit of an experiment to see if we could put specialists from the U.S. and China who just focus on American politics together. And I think it was a resounding success. While the future of the Republic definitely looks a little bit shaky, I certainly feel like I have a better understanding of it. And it just proves to me it's important for our communication channels between the United States and China to remain open. That's something that we're committed to at Georgetown, especially in the U.S. China Global Issues Dialogue. And so we will continue with that agenda as we think about future events. To those of you watching and listening today, thanks again for joining us. And we look forward to future events. Thank you very much.